October 29, 1956, Israeli armored columns crossed the border of the Sinai Peninsula and rushed deep into the Egyptian desert. Among the tanks and armored vehicles, low-slung tracked machines moved across the scorching sand, with short but powerful barrels of 105mm howitzers protruding from their turrets. These were French self-propelled artillery units, the AMX Mark 61, which for the first time in their history found themselves in real combat, not under the French flag, but under the flag of Israel. The Egyptians, accustomed to duels with tanks, faced something unexpected. Mobile howitzers fired from closed positions, quickly changed locations, and again rained high-explosive fragmentation shells down on trenches and fortifications. But to understand how this unusual machine came into existence and why it ended up thousands of kilometers from France, one must go back 10 years to war-torn post-war Europe. By 1946, France was a country desperately trying to restore its own dignity. 4 years of German occupation had destroyed not only industry and infrastructure, but the very reputation of the French army. Once one of the world's strongest military powers, it now depended on American supplies for literally everything, from rifles to heavy artillery. French generals understood perfectly well that such dependence was humiliating and dangerous. America could change priorities at any moment, and France would be left without modern weaponry. That is why, immediately after the war, French military engineers received orders to develop their own armored vehicles, which would allow the country to regain its status as a serious military power. The first and main project was the light tank AMX-13. Its design began in that very year of 1946 at the Issy-les-Moulineaux facility, which belonged to the state association AMX. The task was ambitious: to create a light, fast, and well-armed tank that could be mass-produced even with the limited resources of the post-war economy. French designers approached the task with a good deal of ingenuity and proposed a number of unconventional solutions that subsequently made the AMX-13 one of the most mass-produced post-war tanks in the world. But parallel to the work on the tank, another acute problem faced the French military: artillery. During the Second World War, the French army actively used the American 105mm howitzer M101. It was a reliable and proven weapon, but it belonged to the United States, not France. French artillerymen had studied this howitzer well, knew all its strengths and weaknesses, and now wanted to create something similar but their own, French, preferably with improved characteristics. Thus began the parallel development of a 105mm towed howitzer, which later received the designation MLE-50. The name pointed directly to the year the weapon was supposed to be ready for operation, 1950. And this is where something happened that determined the fate of our story. Someone among the French military or engineers, and history, unfortunately, has not preserved the name, noticed a simple fact. They were simultaneously creating a light and mobile tracked chassis and a new 105mm howitzer. What if they crossed them? The idea was so obvious and timely that it received immediate support from the military leadership. Self-propelled artillery had proven its colossal value during the Second World War. The Germans, Americans, and the Soviet Union all actively used self-propelled howitzers that could quickly change positions, evade return fire, and support advancing troops without falling behind the tanks. The French saw clearly how effectively Soviet and American self-propelled guns worked on the battlefields and did not intend to lag behind their former allies. A towed howitzer is good for defense, but in an offensive, it becomes a burden. While the crew deploys the gun, zeroes in, limbers up, and attaches it to a tractor, the tanks have already moved far ahead. A self-propelled artillery unit solved this problem elegantly. It moved with the tanks, stopped, fired a few shots, and immediately changed position. Therefore, the decision to mount the new howitzer on the chassis of the new tank was not just logical, but vital for a French army dreaming of regaining the ability to conduct full-scale offensive operations. By 1950, when the Memel 50 Howitzer was ready and the chassis was already undergoing tests, French engineers assembled the first prototype of the new self-propelled gun. The 23 caliber barrel was installed in an all-welded steel turret, which was placed in the rear part of the AMX-13 tank chassis. The machine turned out to be compact, relatively light, and most importantly, fully functional. The first prototype was immediately sent for field testing, and French military officials could finally touch what they had dreamed of since the end of the war: their own self-propelled artillery unit, independent of America or anyone else. Testing of the first prototype continued for about 2 to 3 years. During this time, French engineers eliminated many defects inevitable for any new combat vehicle. By 1952, the self-propelled Howitzer AMX Mark 61 was deemed ready, and in 1953, it was put into serial production. For post-war France, which until recently could not afford to produce even simple armored vehicles, this was a serious achievement. But what was this machine that so many people had worked on for nearly 7 years? Let us start with what lay at the heart of the entire construction: the chassis of the AMX-13 light tank. The running gear included 5 road wheels on each side, and the suspension was torsion bar-based, which provided a sufficiently smooth ride even over rough terrain. For a self-propelled howitzer, this was critically important, as the crew had to work with ammunition inside a cramped fighting compartment, and every strong jolt on the march could result in injury or damage to the shells. The torsion bar suspension softened the impacts, and although the off-road ride could hardly be called comfortable, the machine did not fall apart even on stony dirt roads. The layout of the AMX Mark 61 differed significantly from most self-propelled guns of that time. The driver's station was located on the left in the front part of the hull. He had his own hatch and 3 periscopes for road observation. The central periscope could be replaced with a night vision device if necessary, which was a fairly progressive solution for the early 50s. To the right of the driver, also in the front part of the hull, was the engine and transmission compartment. This front engine placement was not the most typical, but it freed up the entire rear part of the hull for the fighting compartment and turret, which was of fundamental importance for an artillery unit. The heart of the machine was an 8-cylinder gasoline engine, SFOM, with a power of 250 horsepower. By the standards of heavy armored vehicles, this was not much, but the AMX Mark 61 weighed only 16.5 tons, and this power was quite enough to accelerate the machine to 60 kilometers per hour on the highway. For a self-propelled howitzer, this was an excellent speed, allowing it to keep up with tank columns on the march. The transmission had 5 forward gears and 1 reverse gear, and the cruising range was 350 kilometers with a fuel tank capacity of 450 liters. The gasoline engine was, of course, thirsty and a fire hazard compared to a diesel engine, but the French industry at that time banked on gasoline motors. Now for the most important part, the turret and armament. An all-welded steel turret was installed in the rear part of the hull. Here, one must immediately clarify that the word turret in the case of the AMX Mark 61 sounds somewhat deceptive. The fact is, it did not rotate. Horizontal aiming of the gun was carried out only 20 degrees to the left and 20 degrees to the right. For a more significant change in firing direction, the entire machine had to be turned. For a self-propelled howitzer firing from closed positions at pre-calculated coordinates, this was quite acceptable. However, in the event of a sudden encounter with the enemy, such a design became a serious drawback. On the other hand, the vertical aiming was quite impressive, from -4 to +66 degrees. Such a large elevation angle allowed for high-angle fire at significant distances, which is the main task of any self-propelled howitzer. The 105mm gun Masel 50 was equipped with a muzzle brake, which partially dampened the powerful recoil upon firing, as well as a gun shield transferred directly from the towed version of the Howitzer. The maximum firing range reached 14,500 meters, and the rate of fire was 6 rounds per minute, which was a good indicator for a weapon with separate loading ammunition. Loading here was entirely manual, as was the aiming. No automation or mechanized shell feeding was provided. The crew consisted of 5 people, a driver, commander, gunner, and 2 loaders. The main physical burden fell on the loaders, as they had to manually move shells and charges from the racks located along both walls of the turret. The ammunition load consisted of up to 56 shells, the majority of which were high-explosive fragmentation shells designed to hit infantry and destroy field fortifications. But the arsenal also included heat shells capable of penetrating up to 350 millimeters of homogeneous armor at a distance of 1,000 meters when hitting at a right angle, making the self-propelled gun dangerous even for heavy enemy tanks when firing directly. For self-defense, the commander could use a machine gun mounted on the turret roof. Usually, this was a French AA-52 machine gun of 7.62mm caliber with an ammunition load of 2,000 rounds. Additionally, there were embrasures in the sides of the turret through which the crew could fire personal weapons without leaving the machine. Entry into the fighting compartment was possible through a double door in the rear part of the turret, and there were 2 hatches on top for the commander and gunner. The commander had his own cupola with periscopes allowing for 360-degree circular observation. The dimensions of the AMX Mark 61 were quite modest, 5.7 meters in length, 2.65 meters in width, and 2.7 meters in height. Compared to the American M109 self-propelled gun, which would appear later and become its main competitor, the French machine looked almost miniature. Such compact dimensions gave a certain advantage. The self-propelled gun was easier to camouflage in position. It passed more easily along narrow European roads and bridges, and its relatively small mass allowed for the transport of the machine over long distances without the use of heavy transporters. But compactness also had a downside. It was cramped inside, and the crew of 5 had to work literally in each other's arms and alongside 56 shells carefully laid out on racks along the turret walls. On these same racks, by the way, not only ammunition but also other necessary property could be transported, making the machine a sort of warehouse on tracks. Brackets for pioneer tools, picks, shovels, crowbars, and other devices without which artillerymen in the field cannot manage, were provided on the outside of the turret. The double door in the rear also had special compartments for transporting necessary equipment. French engineers tried to use every centimeter of space. Although their solutions were not always elegant, they were practical. In total, more than 400 units of the AMX Mark 61 rolled off the assembly line. A significant portion of them was intended not for the French army, but for export. France in the post-war years desperately needed foreign currency to restore its economy, and the sale of armaments became an important source of income. The first and largest foreign customer turned out to be the Netherlands. The Dutch, like the French, were looking for a way to strengthen their army after the war, and the French self-propelled gun attracted their attention primarily because of its affordable price and decent performance characteristics. However, the Dutch military was not entirely satisfied with the standard version. They were unhappy with the firing range and demanded the installation of a longer barrel. Thus appeared the modification for the Netherlands, which received the designation AMXPRA, which stood for Armored Tracked Artillery. This version featured a gun with a barrel length of 30 calibers instead of 23, which significantly increased the muzzle velocity of the projectile and the engagement range. The Dutch received their machines and were so satisfied with them that they operated them significantly longer than the French themselves. Another interesting modification was developed for Switzerland. The Swiss military, known for their meticulousness and high requirements for weaponry, asked for a version with a full 360-degree rotating turret. This modification received the designation AMX 105B, also known as Mark 62. French designers developed several prototypes and sent them to Switzerland for testing. It would seem that a rotating turret was exactly what the base version lacked, as it would have eliminated the machine's main tactical disadvantage. But the Swiss, after thoroughly studying and testing everything, ultimately refused the purchase. The AMX 105B version never went into serial production, remaining only an interesting experiment. In addition to the Netherlands, the machines were sold to Israel, and it was these deliveries that turned out to be the most fateful for the reputation of the AMX Mark 61. In the 50s, Israel was in a state of constant military threat from neighboring Arab states and bought weaponry wherever it could. France, during that period, was one of the key arms suppliers for the Israeli army, and self-propelled howitzers were included in the supply package, along with AMX-13 tanks and fighter jets. The Israeli military accepted the new equipment with enthusiasm, quickly mastered it, and integrated it into artillery units. They were to be the first to test the AMX Mark 61 in real combat, and that test was not far off. Furthermore, the self-propelled guns were supplied to Morocco and Indonesia, although these contracts were significantly smaller in volume. Thus, the French self-propelled howitzer was scattered across several continents, from Western Europe to Southeast Asia and North Africa. For a machine created in a hurry and primarily for domestic needs, this was an impressive commercial result. More than 400 units produced is a figure that says the AMX Mark 61 turned out to be successful enough to interest buyers outside of France. Despite all its compromises and limitations, in the autumn of 1956, the situation around the Suez Canal heated up to the limit. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the canal, infuriating Great Britain and France, who considered this waterway their strategic artery. Israel, in turn, suffered from constant raids by Egyptian fedayeen across the border and a blockade of the Straits of Tiran, which cut off access to the Red Sea. The three countries entered into a secret agreement. Israel would launch an offensive on the Sinai Peninsula, and Great Britain and France, under the pretext of protecting the canal, would move their troops into the conflict zone. The plan was daring, cynical, and perfectly coordinated. The Israeli army began Operation Kadesh on October 29th. Several armored and infantry brigades moved across the Sinai in several directions, striving to reach the canal as quickly as possible and defeat the Egyptian garrisons. Within the artillery units of the advancing forces were AMX Mark 61 self-propelled howitzers, received from France shortly before the start of the conflict. For the Israeli artillerymen, this was completely new equipment, and they had very little time to master it. No voina nijdiot, and the crews had to learn right in battle. The Sinai Peninsula is a vast space of desert, crossed by wadis, dry riverbeds, rocky ridges, and sandy plains. For self-propelled artillery, such terrain was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, the flat open spaces provided an excellent view and allowed for firing at maximum range without interference. On the other hand, the lack of natural cover meant that a battery immediately revealed itself after opening fire and could become a target for a counterstrike. This is where the mobility of the AMX Mark 61 proved to be a decisive factor. After several volleys, the self-propelled guns quickly changed positions, preventing Egyptian observers from correcting return fire. The Egyptian army in the Sinai was numerous but poorly prepared for a rapid maneuvering battle. Fortified positions along main roads and passes were designed for long-term defense. However, the Israelis acted so quickly that many Egyptian garrisons found themselves surrounded before they could organize full resistance. In these conditions, the self-propelled howitzers performed the classic task of artillery support, suppressing firing points before infantry and tank attacks, destroying field fortifications, and preventing the Egyptians from regrouping. 6 rounds per minute of high explosive fragmentation shells, multiplied by several machines in a battery, created enough fire density to force the defenders to hug the ground and cease resistance. Operation Kadesh ended in a few days with the complete defeat of Egyptian forces in the Sinai. The Israeli army occupied the entire peninsula, although it was subsequently forced to retreat under pressure from the Soviet Union and the United States. For the AMX Mark 61, the Suez Crisis was a baptism of fire, and the machine proved to be sufficiently reliable and effective in a real conflict. Но настоящий экзамен еще был впереди. In June 1967, the Six-Day War broke out, becoming one of the most lightning-fast and impressive military conflicts of the 20th century. Israel, surrounded by hostile states, launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. On June 5th, the Israeli Air Force destroyed most of the Egyptian aviation right on the airfields, after which ground troops again rushed through the Sinai. This time, the scale of the operation was significantly larger, and the Egyptian army was much better armed. Over the past 11 years, Egypt had received a huge amount of Soviet equipment, including tanks, artillery, and anti-aircraft systems. The AMX Mark 61 self-propelled howitzers were once again in the thick of things. By that time, Israeli artillerymen already had rich experience operating these machines and knew all their strengths and weaknesses. Unlike the Suez Crisis, the crews now acted confidently and cohesively, squeezing the maximum possible out of the equipment. The self-propelled guns worked against fortified Egyptian positions, supported tank breakthroughs, and suppressed enemy artillery batteries. The war lasted only 6 days, but during this time, the Israeli army defeated the armed forces of 3 states, capturing the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, the West Bank of the Jordan River, and East Jerusalem. For a small country facing total destruction, this was a victory that entered military textbooks worldwide. The AMX Mark 61 worked through both wars without serious complaints, proving that even a machine created in a hurry and with many compromises is capable of effectively performing its tasks if it falls into the hands of competent and motivated crews. The Six-Day War was the last major conflict in which the AMX Mark 61 played a significant role. After 1967, the world around this machine began to change rapidly and not in its favor. Military technologies took a great leap forward. New self-propelled howitzers appeared with rotating turrets, mechanized shell feeding, increased firing range, and improved crew protection. Against this background, the French self-propelled gun with its fixed turret, manual loading, and modest armor looked increasingly obsolete. France itself was the first to start phasing out its machines. In 1969, the French army began withdrawing the AMX Mark 61 from the combat strength of artillery units. By that time, the machines had served for about 16 to 17 years, which was a quite decent term for armored vehicles of the mid-20th century. By then, the French military had already received a new self-propelled artillery unit of its own design, which surpassed the AMX Mark 61 in almost all parameters. The old self-propelled guns were decommissioned systematically. Some were sent for scrapping, some were put into storage, and some were offered for sale to those who were still willing to buy them. Things were quite different in the Netherlands. The Dutch, who received their machines in the AMX-PRA modification with an extended barrel, continued to operate them for many years after France had abandoned its own. The Dutch army kept the equipment in exemplary order, regularly conducted technical maintenance, and modernized individual components, which allowed the machines to be kept in combat-ready condition significantly longer than the creators themselves had expected. The Netherlands was a member of NATO, and within the alliance, each country was required to maintain a certain level of armed forces. The AMX-PRA self-propelled howitzers performed their role in the structure of Dutch defense quite properly, and for a long time, there was simply no urgent need to change them for something new. Only in 1985, more than 30 years after the start of serial production, did the Netherlands finally begin withdrawing the AMX-PRA from service. By this time, European armies were massively switching to the American M109 self-propelled howitzer, which became a kind of standard for NATO countries. This machine surpassed the French self-propelled gun in all key characteristics. It had a full rotating turret, greater firing range, better crew protection, and a more modern fire control system. The Dutch, like other European countries, chose unification with their alliance allies. The decommissioned Dutch self-propelled guns did not immediately go to the scrap heap. Some of the machines, still quite fit for operation, were sold to Indonesia and Morocco. For these countries, which did not have the opportunity to buy the latest Western equipment, even obsolete European self-propelled guns were a valuable acquisition. During that period, Indonesia was actively increasing its military potential and was ready to buy almost any available weaponry. Morocco, having long and restless borders, needed mobile artillery to patrol desert territories. Thus, the machines created in France in the early 50s continued their service in completely different climatic conditions and on different continents, having long outlived the tasks for which they were originally created. The remaining specimens that could not be sold were simply decommissioned and sent for recycling. Armored hulls were cut for metal, engines were dismantled for spare parts, and the turrets with 105mm barrels, which until recently had struck terror into Egyptian positions in the Sinai Desert, turned into heaps of steel scrap. Thus ended the story of a machine that was born from post-war France's desperate desire for independence from American weapons, went through 2 Middle Eastern conflicts, served the armies of 5 countries on 3 continents, and finally gave way to more advanced successors. It did not become legendary, did not enter the top 10 best self-propelled guns in the world, and did not receive glowing reviews from military experts. But it did exactly what it was created for. It gave France its own self-propelled artillery at a time when the country needed it most, and honestly served its time on the battlefields and training grounds from Western Europe to Southeast Asia.